Hello everyone, it's Andy from Ham and Jam here. I'd like to dedicate this episode to my father Alan, who passed away recently. Not only was he our greatest supporter, but he's also the main reason why I had a love of history in the first place. So wherever you are, Pops, I'd like to say cheers and Ham and Jam.
Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Bring up the boys. It just doesn't have the same kind of ring to it, does it, Andy?
No.
As say, bring up the PIAT. Hello, listeners, to another episode of Ham and Jam. I'm your co-host, Kevin Getz, from over here in the States with my number one pilot. Andy, how you doing?
Hello Kev, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic.
I've been looking forward to this one.
This one's going to be really interesting. And if you haven't gathered yet, we're going to talk about a little known piece of equipment. And I can't think of a better guest to have on our podcast because he actually has one. Kallan Kriewall.
This is indeed a pleasure and honor to have you on our podcast.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm very much excited to be a part of this.
So, as always, as our custom, what do we have?
Well, I've been saving this one for a special occasion. I've had it for about a year now, and I figured I'd finally pull it out. We might not be bringing up the PIAT. We might be bringing up the boys, and I'm certainly going to be bringing up Patton's Armored Diesel. It's a bourbon. It was inspired by his grandson, I believe. Yeah, George Patton Waters. And I'm gonna give it a go. It's a cane-spirited Kentucky bourbon.
Very good. Andy, let me guess. Starts with a G, ends with an S.
Well, it does begin with a G.
Yes.
But it ain't a Guinness.
Sorry, folks. I just fell out of my chair.
He's off again. I'm having a gin and tonic. Now, I will hasten to add there is no umbrella in my glass, okay?
Very good. I'm going with the old speckled hen. Gentlemen, cheers.
Cheers.
So, Cal, we wanted to bring you on because I don't know how many of our listeners really know about the boys' anti-tank rifle. At least over here in the States, there is so little known. Andy, what's it like over in the UK? Do they even know about it?
Yeah, I mean, it was only used for the first few years of the war. I think they finally stopped phasing them out end of 43, I think. You still saw them on Bren gun carriers, but yeah, it really has been overshadowed, shall we say, by the PIAT. And obviously, that famous meme from A Bridge Too Far, bring up the PIAT.
That is certainly by popular culture standards, it's been classed.
But I think we ought to say as well is not only has Cal got a boys anti-tank rifle, it is actually a fully functioning one as well, which is something you will not find outside of specialist museums in the UK.
Yeah, and I'll kind of chirp in right now and just kind of give myself a little introduction on that kind of stuff. Since I was about 6 years old, I really loved history, and my mom gave me a book on the U.S. presidents, and I got to Abraham Lincoln, and I saw a painting of the Battle of Antietam where masses of men were picking up arms and fighting and trying to kill each other, and I just couldn't comprehend and understand what would create a human being to do such a thing. So as much as I love collecting these firearms and these weapons, I want to emphasize that it's the man behind the gun. This is somebody's father. This is somebody's husband or fiance. It's a very sombering story when you paint it like that. And so ever since that age, I started to research and collect and build up my display.
So before we get into the boys, obviously there has to be some form of a transition from Civil War living history, understanding the Civil War, to British military history. What did that transition look like?
So Civil War is my first true love. Naturally, here in the United States, that is, perhaps even worldwide, that is the largest form of reenacting. I've seen units in Europe reenact it as well. There's just something about that story and the numbers. I mean, I've seen events that there's more reenactors than there were combatants during the actual battle. You're talking tens of thousands of reenactors. And so to smell the smoke and that camaraderie, it was addicting. You know, like with most history, you kind of want to expand. So I jumped to World War II, and then I realized, I skipped the First World War. And so during the centennial, I really dived deep into that. And looking at my collection, I noticed that my knowledge was a mile wide, but only an inch deep. And so I decided that, I really want to focus on something. And so I decided to really stick with the Commonwealth. And mind you, that's a huge subject on its own. Because again, it's not just England, right? I mean, you have so many nations and even nations in exile, right, that are fighting. It's an incredible story to be told. So going forward, I can spend my entire life and I can probably focus on just one battle if I wanted to, like say Arnhem or Normandy, and I won't learn everything. And it kind of drives me crazy, but it's an exciting thing. Now, you can try your best, right? I've got family in England, so I guess I'll say shout out to them. Being first generation American, I had family that served in the world wars for the Brits, closer to my blood than even Americans in terms of, a distant family that served in the world wars. So personally, I got that connection, but I don't know, there's something striking about it that just captivates me. And again, it not being appreciated as it ought to be here in the United States, Kevin, as you're well aware of, that's where our friendship has flourished, is trying to combat that.
So the boy's anti-tank rifle, what is its genesis?
This is going to be quite a tangent, but I will make you guys a promise. I know and understand this is a British Airborne podcast. I will make sure all loose ends are tied and I will connect the dots. But to begin the story, we do need to go back a little bit. To understand World War II, we need to understand World War I, and just bear with me as I go on this tangent. I promise if you guys entertain me, it will be well worth it. So, World War I, right? The war to end all wars. It's an incredible story because the reason why they call it the war to end all wars is every combatant nation had something to gain. You have, Russia and France fighting later into the Alsace-Lorraine and, in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. Those old scores aren't settled. You have the wars in the Balkans. You have a massive alliance system that everyone's tied in. And all nations wanted their rightful spot in the sun. The Germans called it their Tag, their day. And so it was an era of inventions. You have trench warfare that was capitalized in the race to the sea back in 1914. And the following were attempts to break this. And so a few examples that I was able to come up with and think of is, you think about, to fight trenches, that is, flamethrowers. There was over 650 attacks that the Germans used to break these lines. France in 1914 had 132 aircraft. And yet by 1918, they were making that same number every single week. So the number of inventions is just truly incredible. Close your eyes and just imagine this. If you're a listener and you're driving on the road, let's not do that. But early morning, April 22nd, 1915, you're awake in your trench and you awake to this sweet chloric smell, and it's irritating like pepper. And, you look over no man's land and you see this greenish yellow fog that's about 2 meters tall, slowly creeping towards you. And soon enough, you're caught in that fog and you see men clutching their throats and stumbling as they panic to escape, and many collapse where they stand, and their eyes are red and, coughing up blood as the chlorine attacks, your lungs and your eyes and your throat. And pretty much the modern chemical warfare is born. It's a Pandora's box that no one could have imagined is open. So again, you got chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, killed over 90,000 people. You got hundreds of thousands forever affected post-war, and many of these lives were cut short. It crippled nations due to debt. It cost the Allies $190 billion. That's 1918 dollars. 6,000 square miles of France was destroyed. That's 2 miles wide from New York to San Francisco. There was all these ways to, again, break this static war. All right, so here's where I'm going to connect the dots. How do you break this? Well, again, September 16th, 1916, it's Fleurs Courcelette. Enter the tank, all right? You see where I'm going now? So imagine that same fear you felt with mustard gas creeping towards you that previous year. This time, creeping towards you is a slow yet intimidating speed and a roar of an engine. You got 4 Vickers machine guns, which are firing at a rate of about 8 rounds a second. If it's a female tank, you have 2 6-pounder Hotchkiss cannons. If it's a male, it's a shell 32 feet long, and it's rolling towards you, and it's weighing about 60,000 pounds. This is the British Mark I tank. And to make matters worse, the French deployed their tanks in June of 1917. Now, it wasn't until April of 1918, so a year and a half roughly after that, Germany had actually a tank to fight back. And so the first tank-on-tank battle was at Flers-Bretonneux. And it was imperative that something was quickly made to combat this. German armor-piercing 8mm rifles, the Gewehr 98s, struggled to fight against this armor. And so enter the first anti-tank rifle. A prototype firearm was chambered in a new anti-tank and anti-aircraft round, and it was actually meant to be used on the Maxim machine gun. And Army High Command, the Germans that is, wanted something sooner than later. So they developed what's known as the 13mm Tup, which is Tank und Flieger aircraft. It was slapped onto an enlarged Gewehr, which is rifle hybrid. It was a mix between their 2 standard rifles, the 88 and the 98. It had extra gas vents, 4 locking lugs, and it was just this massive rifle, oversized rifle. Production began in 1918. By the war's end, they had about 16,000 of these. And the United States was able to capture these weapons and test fire them for their 50 caliber rounds. So again, it started off as a prototype, but was pushed into service. And it kind of completed full circle because, again, the U.S. ended up testing their 50 caliber BMGs on that chassis, if you will. So, interwar, immediately after the war ended, all nations began to recover, repopulate, and rebuild. Now, in no time out of fear for a repeat, a second era of inventions and perfecting older designs began in the 20s and the 30s. So, as I mentioned, for example, the United States used captured T-Gewehr, tank Gewehr actions to test their 50 caliber rounds. This completed full circle. And then got other nations. You have the Russians copying this exact design in the 30s before the PTRD. And my point is all nations began to experiment with new forms of warfare, be it anti-tank weapons or new ways of warfare such as paratroopers, right? So give me a second. I'll get there.
No. Very, very good, mate. You keep going. This is excellent stuff.
Good. I'm telling you. It's a tangent, but it's going to be well worth your while. Now, shout out to Neil Cherry. He mentioned in a previous podcast that the British and German military advisors went to Russia and he saw the potential for paratroopers. And the Germans noted the potential use for their future blitzkrieg tactics, whereas the British, respectfully, were in a bit of an identity crisis in terms of what to prioritize when it comes to modernizing. Do you come up with new tactics? Do you capitalize on what you learned in the First World War and focus on your old technology? So they chose to keep the traditional fighting order, but they changed the fighting structure with weaponry. So, for example, we're well familiar in the community with the Bren gun. The BR stands for Bruno, which was a Czech armory producing the ZB light machine gun. And the Brits decided to rechamber that into their 303, and they adopted that firearm once trials approved it in 37. The N stands for Enfield, which is that factory producing the gun, and ergo the Bren. That same year, they adopted new webbing known as the Patterns 37 to support these new weapons. It wasn't around this point that their conservative thinking that the British focused on the fears of a repeated World War I, and they developed an anti-tank rifle. All right, so this is where we can finally began.
Yeah.
Thanks for humoring me there. So we got the boys. So let's pause for a second. It's been discussed amongst us that here in the States, the British under Montgomery are viewed as overly cautious. You know, with my previously mentioned statistics with the Great War, I hope the listener can understand the conservative approach the empire took. That is to improve current technology as a repeat versus new technology such as the Blitzkrieg or German Fallschirmjägers. Monty saw the sum. We know that 60,000 of these Brits fell in a single day, a third of which were outright killed. Then he just saw just as terrible Passchendaele.
It's really interesting how when the tech is happening, something new comes along. It's oh my God, we have got to find something to counter it.
Well, I mean, you see exactly the same thing in every war in human history. You look at the German panzers at the start of the Second World War, and then, well, not even 5 years later, you've got a Königstiger rolling around. You know, so compare the Panzer I to a King Tiger, and it's only a few short years afterwards. And you're still seeing that today. Look at the war in Ukraine. Drones. That's the end of the tank. You know, drones and guided missiles, but the countermeasures are already starting to be developed and put in practice. So it's this constant one-upmanship in warfare, and that's going to be the same as long as humans, unfortunately, carry on fighting each other.
Yeah, but that was the question that High Command on all nations were trying to figure out. Do you come up with something totally new to break that line? Again, Germans with the Blitzkrieg and the Fallschirmjäger, and it worked in the beginning. It really did. Or again, do you take that conservative approach? Do you focus on perfecting what you previously had? So going back to the boys, it was designed by Captain H.C. Boys. Anti-tank rifles were dabbled with in the 20s. You know, as I mentioned, they're starting to get an idea of how do we proceed. It wasn't officially requested by the Empire until 1934. So 34, at that point, things are starting to kind of look a little dim. You know, you got the rise of Hitler the year previous. You have Japan making its expansion. You have Italy making talks about Africa. And it was time to start bolstering your arms and munitions. So initially, it finished in 1937. That is the development stage. And they originally chambered the anti-tank rifle in the 50 BMG, the American 50. Testing didn't give it the armor penetration that they were looking for. And so they bumped it up to a 55 caliber and they kept that same cartridge length. So here in the States, there's plenty of boys anti-tank rifles that still, again, they're the same case length, but they're just a neck down round. So the way a caliber worked, It's measured in hundredths of an inch. So a 50 cal is 50 hundredths of an inch. If you simplify, that's half an inch. So 55 cal, just over a half an inch. It's firing around roughly the size of your thumb. So the case length stayed 99 millimeters. Logic tells me that you'd want a smaller caliber at a higher velocity. But again, this is a transitional era where they chose that larger, heavier hitting round. So production began in 1938. It was originally called the stanchion gun. And days before military acceptance, Captain Boyce died, and it was then turned to be named after him. And that's when production finally began.
Were there other competing, or was this just...
In the 20s, there was. They were experimenting with single-shot rifles very much after the German T-Gewehr. It was more of like a copy and paste situation because, again, they didn't know what the future of things was going to look like. But again, you see the growth of German armor and mobilization. Things start to really take shape that this is going to be an armored vehicle war. And so again, in 34, that's when High Command said, all right, we need actually something dedicated for this. So it was kind of a side project until 1934. Again, I don't have an answer for you exactly who, what, where, when, and why, and how, but I can tell you for sure that the British did have prototypes. They did prototype back into the 20s.
Clearly, British military circles are looking ahead going, like you had just said, we're going to see a new type of warfare. It's going to be more mobilized. We need to have something ready to go.
Yep. And can you imagine the panic and the fear of those men thinking, all right, this is going to be different. It's not going to be like how it was in the past. And having to decide, again, what do you capitalize on first? And so 1934, that is still pretty early on in this.
I mean, Hitler only came to power in 33. So, at this time, there wasn't really a panzer arm of the German army. And as well, I'm guessing the intelligence coming out of Germany is that the tanks they're using or armored vehicles they're using aren't these big behemoths that you see at the end of the Second World War. So there isn't this need for like a PIAT or whatever.
That's a great point. And I want to stress that too, that enough armor penetration back in 1937 and 1938 was not enough, even come 43. At the halfway point of the war. I'll talk about it a little later, but with the training pamphlets, you have the Panzer 1s, Panzer 2s, no problem. Panzer 3s, the men were trained just to hit the turret. Hopefully, it'll create some sort of shrapnel that will lodge it and jam it. Men were trained to fire at not the commander, but the loader and the driver for these vehicles. Even though they couldn't improve the firearm, they were improving how to use it. And you got to remember, why are we worried just about the Germans? I mean, you have Japan, you have Italy, and the boys' anti-tank rifle, their baptism under fire was with the Finns in the Winter War, which, again, I will kind of jump into that a little later. So going back to, again, ammunition and the production of it, BSA, they made about 65,000 of them by the time they stopped in 43. And Canada produced about 40,000, again, by 43. And there were two kinds of ammunition. Accurate records have been difficult to find in terms of what did what in trials and testing, but I can tell you that the Mark I was a heavy steel core bullet, whereas the Mark II was a lighter tungsten core. And data out there does not specify, again, which ammunition was used and recorded, but it's safe to say that it was about 1 inch of penetration at 100 yards, which, again, in today's standards isn't. But again, back then, that's a game changer.
Very quickly, Cal, can you actually just describe the boys as a rifle, what it looks like, its operation, etc.?
It's an absolute pig. In fact, I'm huffing and puffing when I'm carrying it. Loaded and ready to go. Historically, it was about 40 pounds. It's long, it's burdensome. The one that I have is sleeved down for a 50, and that added some weight. So mine's running at about 60 pounds. So again, double that. And I'm 6'3", and this gun is just as tall as me, maybe a little taller. Again, it's burdensome. In fact, again, many men didn't like to carry it. You had a two-man team. You had the man carrying the weapon. Preferably, you had two men carrying it, one at the muzzle, one at the butt pad. Then you had another man carrying about 8 boxes of ammunition. If it was the monopod that it's built on can also be attached to vehicles. In fact, that's where most use of the boys was on, like Bren gun carriers. And the Bren gun carriers carried about 160 rounds of ammunition on bandoliers. Again, it was not liked much, again, because of the size and how cumbersome it was. But again, I had the number written here somewhere. On a division level, they issued about 360, I think 361 per division. So every man was trained and cross-trained. That actually was something early on that was, much with like parallel to Airborne with Chatterton, right? The total soldier concept. Men were trained on this. Everyone knew what it was. It's just a really large, heavy, burdensome rifle. Imagine just a typical rifle, but again, it's a 5-round magazine fed from the top, much like your Bren gun. So your sights are offset to your left, so you have to be a right-handed shooter. And the early Mark I's had an adjustable sight for 300 and 500 yards. And in the later Mark IIs, it was just a one single peep sight, I believe 300 yards, but don't quote me on that. These are heavily used at Dunkirk, where they served well. And then after that, you have, again, fighting in Africa, where I will bring up some airborne accounts with the fighting in Africa. But then you also have, again, the fighting in the Pacific against the Japanese. Again, the Empire wasn't just fighting the Germans. I mean, as you guys are well aware, I mean, you were fighting so many different nations with different technologies. So the boys was used until the end of the war to different extents with the Japanese thinner tanks. But again, as we were talking about with the Germans, again, after the Panzer III come the 4, you're pretty much useless. And there was a dire need to have it quickly replaced. So I don't want to go on a deeper tangent, so I'll keep it simple by saying, as I previously mentioned, about 200 of these were sent to Finland when Russia attacked.
Sure.
And that was its baptism in fire. The T-26 tank, those Russian tanks, they did serve fairly well against those. And then about 700 of them were given to the United States. And some were used by the Marine Raiders, which were fighting lightly armored Japanese on like the Solomon Islands and throughout the war as well.
Is the British military circles getting feedback from the Finns?
Again, I don't have a personal record of that, but of course, no doubt there are observers and people that are seeing what's going on. Again, the Finns really did like it. In fact, they used a lot of that design for their Lexi anti-tank rifle. So very similar. They changed a few things up. The Mark I boys had a circular muzzle brake at the end. Looks like a giant pancake. Andy, we know you like those. Coming to America, you wanted to go to a pancake joint. But no, that's definitely a tangent.
He loves his IHOP.
Oh, yeah. Anyways, the issue with these is it kicked up dust, and it was a huge problem, especially in Africa, creating a dust cloud. You can't see what you're looking at. And even against the Russians with the snow, it was an issue. So the Mark IIs had like a harmonica-shaped muzzle brake system that threw the gas out to the side. It reduced recoil. Small things like that the only way to improve your technology is trial through error. So luckily the Finns were able to capitalize on that, and the British were able to adapt that relatively later and still have it used in the war.
What was the rate of fire like on these, Cal? Because obviously it's a bolt action.
It's a bolt action rifle. The bolt on this thing is massive. I mean, if you've held an Enfield bolt, I'd say it's probably about 3 times the size of that. It's heavy. It's burdensome. When I fire it, when I have to pull my bolt back, you almost have to realign your entire target and reset yourself because you're having to work your arm. Obviously, you have your spotter and your loader who's taking care of you. But again, it's just very awkward. But again, in trial, it did accomplish what it needed to be done. So again, it was heavy. It weighed 40 pounds. So again, vehicles is really its main use. Going back to the different models, and before I tie this into the airborne, I mentioned the Mark I. That was the 300 and 500 yard adjustable peep sight. Again, it was a rather complex monopod. So came out was the Mark I Star. That was produced in Canada. That's where our Canadian friends came from. They had a fixed sight, I believe, at 300 yards. Again, that was produced by our respected Canadian friends. So can you guys guess the third model? Kevin, Andy?
I'm going to take a stab at this one. Since this is an airborne podcast, there was a airborne variant.
Correct. Now, this is the third variant, but it was known as the Mark II. So you had the Mark I Star, which was pretty much what was widely issued. Now, the Mark II had a shorter 30-inch barrel, so still a relatively big gun. It was lighter weight, and this made recoil or the kickback absolutely painful and unbearable. It was difficult to control. The shorter barrel exponentially reduced that penetration power. So we were struggling with 1 inch at 100 yards, and this was making a lot less. So pretty much it was useless. It really wasn't ever issued. Stuck with the Mark I and the Mark I Star. There was a later prototype. They started to finally get the idea that if you make a smaller cartridge and faster velocity, you will get somewhere. So they did keep the case length, that 99 millimeter case length of the 50 BMG and the 55 boys, and they necked it down. Instead of a 55 cal, they necked it down to a 30 cal, much like the 303, much like the Bren gun. So the velocity would have been a lot quicker. That, I think, would have been a good combatant even against the Panzer IVs. But at that point, and as that was being put through trial at the end of 43, it was phased out in favor of the PIAT, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. So it had that potential, but again, it was just too little too late. So now, as promised, I'll jump into the airborne. So Andy gave me a great lead, actually, on Mark Urban's book, The Red Devils. And before I get into the first-hand accounts, it's been previously mentioned, and I'm sure that there'll be future episodes on the 2nd Battalion in North Africa, which is what the boys' account that I'm going to be talking about is from. Now, we do need a little context. So deployed to North Africa in November of 42, near Bone, Algeria, which is near the Tunisia border, the 1st Brigade, which was made up of many men of the 2nd, were seizing airfields, bridges, and engaging the enemy as infantry, trying to link up with the British and American armored forces. The British First Army was unable to reach the Paras at Pont du Fa, which the men of the 2nd Battalion under John Frost, which obviously we know the Boonville raid fame, they were forced to retreat some 50 miles to the nearest supporting units. They were attacked and chased multiple times, and they suffered about 250 casualties. They took large quantities of Axis prisoners and recalled in April of 43 to rejoin the rest of the 1st Division to train for Operation Husky, which is obviously the invasion of Sicily. So they fought there well. We know, obviously, to its end at Arnhem Bridge in 44, but I digress there.
If this thing is this awkward, wonky, is it being deployed in canisters? Is it in a glider?
Well, I took my anti-tank rifle apart for the first time for cleaning, and I pretty much had an aneurysm. It was bad. I wasn't happy about it because there's not many videos on the internet on how to do that. You know what? This is a great point. This is why I love firearms, is because not only the history and the story behind it, the last things you can plink with. You know what I mean? Like, you got watches and cars for the foreseeable future until they all go electric. Besides that, you can't tinker with much anymore. So I do love that aspect. Anyways, that night, having the right tools to take things apart, and it was rough. So in terms of properly storing it, like you think of like the different Sten guns you can take apart and, jump with them. Definitely not that. I presume there were canisters. They were definitely brought in transit boxes. I couldn't imagine them being jumped out of an aircraft. Obviously, you would break your bones. That didn't happen.
It was definitely canisters, or until they replaced it would come down in a glider. But yeah, the power is definitely canisters.
Yeah. So imagine Frost's men during these attacks and what it must have looked like. And so, B Company on their defensive hilltops, seeing the advancing armored vehicles spanning east to west with infantry trotting behind them. Imagine at a distance too far for small arms fire. So, yeah, maybe you are bringing up the boys, and taking pot shots, because a 50 BMG here in America, if you had the distance, you could probably hit it 5 miles. I mean, good Lord. I mean, it just keeps going. So at that distance, you have the concussion and the echoes of probably those boys' rifles going off. The distance starts to close in and, shrapnel begins to fly all around you. At 75 yards, you're firing rifle grenades desperately. And before you know it, you hear the voices of the enemy, firing back at you. So you're throwing gammon bombs. The noise just alone, exploding ordnance, the rumble of engines, the concussive thud of these rifles, the dirt being kicked up just from that circular muzzle brake in the heat of battle. There's no time to think. So I guess I'll paraphrase a little bit from that book, because Private Wilkinson, he lugged up a anti-tank rifle with Lieutenant Doug Crawley not far behind him. And they intended to engage an armored car, but the heavy rifle needed to be fired from a prone position. There's no way you can fire it at your shoulder. And so realizing that this armored car was at too high of an elevation, Private Wilkinson tried to lift that muzzle up. It was too heavy to steadily hold it and fire, and especially in the heat of battle. So Lou Lewis, he lied on his back and he lifted the muzzle of the boys so that Wilkinson can fire a shot. And so now spotted, this armored car began to open up at them and with the machine gun fire. And you can imagine what Lewis was screaming to Wilkinson, for God's sake, you're taking too long, aim, fire this thing. A pause ensued, and then you get the blast of the anti-tank rifle, and it's concussive. In fact, I read somewhere where the training for this, that muzzle brake creates this cone around you. So as the operator and the firer, you're fine. But that concussive blast, if you're a man next to it, modern military estimates are saying that you shouldn't fire more than 8 to 10 rounds because of the concussive damage it can do to your body. So again, it creates this concussive shock around you that as the gunman, you're okay. But can you imagine what that must have been like? I mean,
if you're the number two.
Well, exactly. So you fire that gun, and quickly after that, another thud followed, and it was the light cannon fired from that field car. And the anti-tank rifle forced the crew to revert, but not before Lewis was wounded by metal fragments. He recalls that, now it's rather graphic, so I'll leave it up to the listener to read on his report on, again, this is Mark Urban's book. Respectfully put, Private Wilkinson was killed outright and not much left of him was recovered besides that of an eyewitness account. So this fight at close quarters continued until Frost could pull his men out at nightfall. So on March 9th, A Company dug in on Jebel Dis, were being harassed and peppered by German machine guns and artillery fire. Another account used was by Sergeant Frank Linus. He tried to use a boy's anti-tank rifle. He was tired of enemy machine gun fire harassing them throughout the night, and the men weren't able to really combat this machine gun position because against a boy's anti-tank rifle, a machine gun was another weapon of long distance. You can just pepper that entire enemy and keep their heads down. And so even just the mental scarring that would do to a man. So he vowed, he said that the silence will come and he will quiet those crews one way or another. So he chose to use a boy's anti-tank rifle, and he knew at a large distance that the round could fly and penetrate a dug-in position full of sandbags. As a side note, these rifles can penetrate about 14 inches of brick, 10 inches of sandbag to immobilize a target. Yeah. So
Wow.
you can imagine this machine gun's opening up. He's like, I'm sick of this. So what do you do? So with an air-splitting crack, he fired one shot followed by 3 more rounds, and he fired at that large machine gun and the personnel. 3 of the 4 Germans fell relatively quickly. They were killed or wounded, I presume killed outright. And the harassing machine gun was silent. And that day, it was pretty much gone until a night patrol came out and was able to recover the machine gun and a few belts of ammunition. So with all that said, I will conclude by saying that I recommend to watch a Disney movie on YouTube. Yep. You heard me, a Disney one. It was made for the Army in 1942 called Stop That Tank. And it was at that stage where these weapons were all they had before the PIAT, and they were struggling with armor. So it taught the men how to train, how to maintain, aim, load, and fire these weapons, all in a sweet comedic cartoon illustration of the 40s through Disney. I think that's incredible. And again, I encourage the listener to, it's on YouTube.
And there's me thinking you were going to say Snow White.
This just absolutely is the perfect segue. I'm glad you gave that account because, as Andy had said at the start of our episode, yours is a firing boy's anti-tank rifle.
My good buddy Matt Ashcroft, he's got a private range that he lets me plink at once in a while. And so when I first procured the rifle, of course, I was excited to fire it. And it was nicked down to a 50. I figured, all right, he's pretty adamant fellow gun enthusiast and collector of the historical types. And so he has a target, and it cost him a good amount of money. I don't remember how much they go for. I'm talking probably $400 or $500 for a massive steel target. And it's rated for 50 BMG and it's AR 500 armor. When I purchased the rifle, I asked the gentleman, do you happen to have any ammunition that you would throw along with it? Because let's face it, it's about, well, for cheap stuff, it's about $5 a round. And for the more expensive stuff, it's about $15 to $20 a round. And he gave me a box of unidentified ammunition, about 50 of them. So I was smiling. I was happy. I thought, wow, this is going to last me quite a while. I got about $500, $750 worth of ammunition. And I fired the first round and it hit the target, and it was just beautiful. We all were smiling, having a good time. All right, load up another one. So I loaded up another one, and I didn't realize that the batch was mixed with Vietnam era surplus rounds. So the one that you guys can see right now, you see how it's red tipped and gray tipped? It's a Ralphus round. It's armor-piercing incendiary tracers. And a lot of the ammunition that this gentleman gave me, being, 50, 60 years old, this one I'm holding is dated 73, the paint wore off. And so I loaded it in the gun and I fired it, and it hit the target, and it looked like a firework went off. And we quickly run up to the target. Mind you, the target was about, I'd say 200, 250 yards away. And we go up to it, and it put a hole right through this $500 target. It smoked it. It literally looked like somebody put a torch up to it and seared it, burnt it. It was a white target, turned it black, punched a hole right through this bulletproof armor.
How thick was it, the steel?
At least half an inch. I'd say at least, I might venture and say 3/4 inch thick. And again, this is armor. This is armor plating. This is military. This isn't a cheap target. And I'm so thankful because I felt awful. Of course, I offered to get a new one. I offered to weld it because I can at least fill the hole up. And Matt goes, well, I can't be mad. That was pretty cool. And so I was saved by his grace on that one, and I'm appreciative of that.
Describe pulling the trigger for our listeners.
It's not a bad gun to fire. It's a very heavy trigger pull. You got to mean to fire it, but the thing is dead nuts. I mean, it's accurate. I could split a rope with that thing. I mean, it's a great shooter. I wish I had more land to take it out to past 200 yards because it can definitely perform. The recoil on it, because of my heavy jacketed barrel, it's more the concussion. That concussion is just deafening, and you feel it go through your throat, down your whole body, and out your feet. I mean, it just rides you like a wave. The recoil is pleasant. I can take it. It's enjoyable. However, that shorter barrel that the Brits had during the war that were jacketed 55, that were a lot lighter, It was painful. The men had issues with it, let alone the airborne. 30-inch barrel. I mean, they felt it all. And I mean, it's got a huge leather butt pad on it too, or foam padding on it. And then it's actually on a chassis too, where when you fire it, that gun at the top glides about an inch, and that absorbs a lot of the recoil and then compresses into this massive heavy spring. So you really don't feel it. You just get a massive shockwave punch and an angry target on the other side, and a lot of smiles and an empty wallet.
Sure.
I will end by saying this, though, that after the war, Canada did a trial on what was the most effective weapons during the war. What was good? What do they want to keep? What would they adjust? And second to the Bren gun was the PIAT. PIAT placed second. It was extremely effective. That's why it's been proven. It did what it needed to do. And the weapon itself, the way it transported the warhead, I mean, it wasn't a velocity-based weapon. You could go up to a tank and hit it with a PIAT round and it would do the same amount of damage.
Well, I mean, talking about the PIAT, I think the PIAT is very underrated and gets a bad press, I think. And I think that's going to be an episode in all in itself. I've got my own thoughts on the PIAT, and I do my bit whenever I do my living history of trying to bust some of the myths about the PIAT. And there's a lot out there. Definitely the subject of a follow-up episode, I think.
I will keep coming back as long as you guys will have me.
Well, thank you, Cal. It's honestly, that has been absolutely fantastic having you on the episode. It really has. I'm so impressed.
I know I've learned a few new things for sure.
Definitely.
Oh.
So
I think it's
I think it is that time. I think the old the landlord's been looking across in the last few minutes. I think he's saying it's time to wrap things up. So we're going to call time, gentlemen, please, on this episode. Thanks ever so much to our listeners for tuning in. Thank you again, Cal, for joining us. So all it remains to say is cheers, gentlemen.
Cheers.
Cheers.
And ham and jam.
Ham and jam.
Ham and jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.